This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and today's topic is based on a listener suggestion, I'm proud to say. It is, what is a possible human language? And what do we mean by that? Well, if you were looking at a grammar, what kinds of things where, if you saw them, should make you go, ooh, I'm a little bit wary of this. I don't know if this grammar is defining things properly, or if this description of this language is really accurate. Certainly there are things like that, because they're so uncommon in human languages. We when we see them, we have to give them a little bit extra scrutiny. And essentially they comprise elements that are on the outside fringes of that set of properties that we would expect of natural languages. And some properties of languages are extremely, extremely common. I'll start this with a thought from Noam Chomsky, who of course is a very famous linguist, and he mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing here, I don't know the exact quote, but if a Martian were to come down to Earth and observe humans speaking to each other, that Martian would certainly assume that all humans spoke the same language. And his point is that human languages, even though they are certainly very diverse, do seem to share characteristics. They do seem to share characteristics, and the amount to which they share characteristics versus things which they simply never do is pretty staggering. Imagine all the logical possibilities for language. All the possible sounds that you might be able to create using your mouth, and yet we have what seems to be a finite number of linguistically used sounds. All the possible structures that hypothetically we could come up with, we still have a finite number of those that are in use in languages. Now, this is an interesting point, but one that is not really well agreed upon. So one camp says, we have a finite number of phones that are used across the world's languages, for example. And that is, evidence that there's some, extreme cases of exclusion. We have so many other sounds that we could make, and yet we don't use them. We only use this particular set of sounds. And the opposite camp says, well, most of the sounds that we can come up with our vocal apparatus, we do use. Right, so I don't think there is all this exclusion, because according to our biology, we only have so much we can make, and it seems that we use most of that set of sounds that we can make in the world's languages. So a lot of these issues are like that, right? They're not so much hot button issues. They're very old issues in linguistics, but they're issues that still are not well agreed upon. I chose this topic in particular because, like I said, I do have a list of topics that have been suggested. And I was flipping through that book that I recommended last episode, which is The World's Major Languages by Bernard Comrie. I was flipping through it and, just looking at properties of different languages. And, I thought this would be a good time to kind of talk about what makes a possible human language. So here we go. Let's start at where I already started, the level of phonology, the sounds of language. Now, like I said, there is, hypothetically, a finite set of sounds in which all of the sounds found around the world in languages fits, or sits, or sets, or whatever, resides within. This would be represented, of course, by the IPA. So if you look at an IPA chart that is complete, you should have a representation, and I say should here with air quotes or sort of a hand motion meant to suggest that I'm being lenient with the term should. You should have a representation of every sound we have attested in the world's languages. And like I said, you need a complete IPA chart. It's more than 100 characters, certainly more than 100 characters, with all the diacritics and all that, all the little tiny symbols that modify the bigger symbols. You have all that, then you'll have what we think is the finite set of sounds that comprises the sounds used by all human languages. So you might say a possible human language must use sounds from that set. That makes sense. It's a bit circular because we built the set from looking at languages in the first place. But there's more that we can say, it turns out. There's more that we can say about the sounds of languages. For example, every language seems to have something like a vowel. Right? There has to be a sonorant sound in the words of a language. And that also seems to be due to biological factors. Right? So obviously the point of language is to communicate. And in order to communicate effectively, you have to be heard. And if you don't have a sonorant element in your word, you're not going to be heard very well, right? So I could say something like, psst, or even worse than psst, could be something like pl, pl, right? A P followed by an L. It's not very easy to hear. I don't even know if the mic picked it up, quite frankly. Something like psst is a little bit better because the s is itself very loud, right? It's a very hissy sound, a sibilant sound. But sonorants seem to be where it's at, right? Vowel sounds and sounds that are like vowels in the fact that they're quite loud. That seems to be where it's at for building words, right? In order to have a syllable, for example, you need some kind of sonorant element. And this seems to be a universal. We don't see languages that lack sonorants entirely. But again, is that due to biology, or has the biology adapted to the language in that way? We would think it's probably due to, just the fact that you need to be heard, and sonorants are louder. So every language has sonorants. You also tend not to see very complex consonant clusters in languages. And of course, this is not going to be an entirely universal. This will be a tendency because some languages do allow quite complex consonant clusters. But the more complex, the less likely. Okay, so English, for example, in a word like strength, there's a ngth at the end and there's a str at the beginning. Those are fairly complex clusters of consonants. Languages tend not to have that. They tend to have very simple clusters if they allow clusters at all. Many languages don't allow clusters at all, right? So that's something to keep in mind. It would be most common to see, mixes or syllables rather made of a single consonant and a single vowel or sonorant sound. That would be very likely. It would be a very sort of common type of language. So if the consonant clusters are too big, you open this grammar and it says, you can have a sequence of 12 consonants in a row. You should question that for two reasons. One, you don't see it common typologically. So if you take a survey of all the world's languages, very few languages will allow that many consonants. In fact, for 12, I don't think there's a language that allows that many. I know there's languages that allow up to, I think, 6 or 7. But you get up in much above that, and as far as I know, there's no attested cases of that. So it would be very, very rare to have that number. And secondly, how would you pronounce it? I mean, just the sheer fact that consonant clusters that long without a sonorant element are essentially going to be useless, right? For the same reason that we can say all languages have sonorants, we can say, you wouldn't have a consonant cluster so long as to essentially make the word useless. It would be very difficult to hear a consonant cluster of 12 consonants in a row, followed by the sonorant, followed by something else. You'd hear the sonorant bit, but all those 12, you'd lose so much detail in that. And of course, this is all, take it with a grain of salt. It might be possible to have a set of consonants in that cluster such that you can hear exactly what they are and you don't have any trouble understanding. But on the whole, you don't have consonant clusters of great length. So in terms of phonology, the things that we would expect are simple consonant clusters and the existence of sonorant elements in the phoneme library, the phones that the language uses, the phonemic inventory. What else could you expect? There are certain sounds which, again, for physical reasons, biological reasons, are difficult to pronounce in sequence. And difficult here is the word I'm putting my weird air quote things on. Because certainly foreign words are hard for people to say, and we don't want to say that all words that are not English are difficult for English speakers to say because they're difficult to pronounce or because they contain difficult sequences. That's not the difficult I'm referring to. That is a fake difficult, right? That's difficult that is only relative to somebody's L1. I'm talking here of difficult in terms of acoustics, right? So, for example, you're not likely to have a voiced sibilant next to a voiceless sibilant because it's acoustically difficult to produce. It's difficult to stop your vocal folds from vibrating and, only vibrate it for half of the total length of the sound, the two phones in sequence, versus simply leaving them voiced or leaving them unvoiced for the entire length of the sound. So across the world's languages, we typically will see assimilation of voicing in sibilants, even more so with nasals. But with nasals, it has to do with place of articulation. So, nasal place of articulation, assimilation, happens all over the place around the world's languages. So would be less likely that a language would leave an alveolar N in place before, say, a bilabial B or P, or even a velar K. We would expect that alveolar N would turn into bilabial M or velar Ng, right? We would expect that. So if you saw in a grammar that you didn't have that kind of nasal assimilation, that would actually be quite a novel thing because that process is so common, right? So a lot of these things like assimilation of nasal place nasal place of articulation assimilation, or voicing assimilation in sibilants. These are things that are quite common. And so to be a human language, we would say that most likely it would have one of those features, right? If we just had a jumble of data and we had to say, is this, definitive of a human language or not? If this particular entity had these two features, we'd be more likely to say yes. Now, that's not to say that there aren't languages out there that don't do this. Maybe there are. I don't know. It's possible. But probably not. Right? Probably it's more likely than not to have those things. What else? In terms of the phonemic inventory, going back to the sounds that the language uses, you typically will have voiceless counterparts before voiced. In other words, if you have a V sound, you'll also have a F sound. So if you have a V sound, you'll have an F sound. And this is so widespread that Mark Ockrand, when he was designing the Klingon language for the Star Trek series, he purposefully broke this tendency, universal, I should say. And I believe Klingon has V's but no F's. And that's something that you just wouldn't see. All right, so to be a possible human language, you would expect if you have voiced counterparts, you have the voiceless one as well. So all this falls under the realm of phonology, right? And there's tons of other stuff I'm sure we could find, most of which would be strong tendencies, right? So, assimilation of voicing for certain phones, assimilation of place of articulation for nasals, certainly, and all the stuff with the phonemic inventory. These are things that we would expect of a human language. Now, let's leave phonology and talk about some other important aspects, namely syntax and morphosyntax. Obviously, we know that there are 6 possible basic word orders: SOV, SVO, VSO, VOS, OVS, OSV. Those are the 6 logically possible word orders, and it's just a permutation, right? You have a subject, you have an object, and a verb, and you can permute those 6 different ways. The question is, are they all actually possible? Are they all attested? And yes, they are. So all 6 orders are attested. So therefore, a human language could theoretically have, or I should say hypothetically, have any of the 6 logically possible orders. In practice, languages will most likely be SOV or SVO. If they're not, then they'll most likely be VSO. And the sort of odd ones out would be the VOS, and to an even lesser extent, OVS and OSV. In fact, OSV is extremely, extremely rare, especially compared, to SOV, SVO. If you look in the World Atlas of Language Structures, wals.info, you find that there's some. If you take the SOV and the SVO together, you get more than 1,000 languages comprising that supergroup, and compare that to exactly 4 languages, which are classified as OSV. So some serious tendencies going on there for your basic word order to be not OSV and really not OVS either. You typically you'll want subject first, most likely, and if you don't have subject first, then you want verb first. That's the nutshell version of what we would expect syntactically to be a possible human language. And the reasons for those word orders have been explained, variously. There's a pretty good consensus that there's a subject-first bias. So between VOS and VSO, for example, VSO is far more common. And that has been cited as good evidence for this subject-first bias. You want the subject before the object, at the very least. You also tend to want to branch in the same direction. So you have things like SVO languages with prepositions and SOV languages with postpositions in terms of their adposition types. And that's been explained variously with branching direction theory and the works of Hawkins and some other people that work in that area, as having to do with the distance between the head of an object and the verb, right? Or the head of a subphrase and the larger phrase above it. So in this case, the VP and the prepositional or postpositional phrases within it. If you have postpositions and verb final, then you've got the postposition and the verb maximally close to each other. If you've got verb initial and prepositions, and you have the preposition and the verb maximally close to each other. So these kinds of patterns we would also very much expect in a possible human language. If we saw something that didn't follow that pattern, it's not impossible. Certainly there's many languages that don't follow that pattern. It would be most common to see that pattern broken. In fact, it would be super common to see the pattern broken with single item elements. So, for example, adjective, noun, or noun, adjective for verb final, you'd see either one, because there simply seems to be no pattern when elements are only single items long. So you could have one adjective and one noun, in which case you've got the whole phrase is just 2 items long. There's no pattern there. You generally don't see it. You only see it when you have longer elements. So relative clauses, for example, will pattern in this way, where nouns will be on either the left or the right, depending on the position of the verb. Likewise, adpositional phrases. The adposition will be on the left or the right, depending on the position of the verb. If you had a language that didn't follow those, it's not impossible. It certainly wouldn't make it an impossible language, but it would be less likely. It would be less likely. And a language which didn't follow those patterns would be of interest to people working in that particular field, trying to explain why the patterns are the way they are. Right? I think, some of them would claim that either the grammar was wrong, or that there was something else that went on in the language that made that quote-unquote non-optimal structure possible. Because certainly it does happen. Now, with all this talk about possible language structures and what makes a possible human language, obviously there's a lot of stuff that we talked about in phonology, less that I talked about syntax. I just talked about basic syntactic patterns, essentially. There's sort of an elephant in the room when you start to get into this kind of stuff, however. And the elephant is, what if you had a language that, let's say, broke one of these universals or these tendencies? What if it broke 2 of these universals or these tendencies. Let's say we had a language that had, I don't know, really complicated consonant structures, and it also had, some OVS order. And not only does it have the OVS order, but it's got prepositions. Right, so that's really three things that are quite strange. Complex consonant structures, OVS order, which is a very rare order, and prepositions on top of it. So given that rare order, you don't have the adposition pattern. What would that mean? Well, let's assume that the grammar is correct. Whoever described this language was absolutely correct in their description, and these things hold true of this language. Perhaps the word order is absolutely, it's very rigid, and that OVS order is rigid. You can't break it. You have to use that order. And those consonant clusters are very complex, and they're very commonly very complex. So most of their words, let's say, had complex consonant clusters in them. Now this just gets less and less plausible the more I tack onto this. But let's say, as food for thought, let's say that this language existed. Would we be able to say, given the fact that we have explained, these patternings with things like efficiency and complexity, would we be able to say that this particular language was less efficient than the average language? Can we say that it's more complex than the average language? You see, once you get into this tendency business, and you get into trying to explain tendencies, very quickly you start treading on ground that you probably don't want to tread on. It's ground that is very it's hot button ground, let's say, and this really is a hot button issue, the issue of complexity in grammars. Can a language be more complicated than another? Can a language be simpler than another? Obviously, it's clear why it's a troublesome issue, because if you're saying that the language of a people is simpler than some other language, you're saying that those people are simpler than some other people. Not explicitly, but that's, many people take it that way. And so it's strange. There is a big, sort of small industry that is looking at possible language structures and recording. Typologists do this all the time. They record common structures and, what you see most commonly, what you would expect most often, so on and so forth. There's tons of work that's been done in that area. And yet, it's never really made sense to me, how we can not say that something is more or less complex than something else, while still using complexity as the measure by which we're explaining patterns. It seems to me that doesn't hold. And let me be clear, I don't want to use complexity as a way to explain these patterns, because for this very reason, I don't think that one language can be more or less complex than another. But once you start looking at possible language structures, you're forced into that corner. You really are. Simply because, we can say no language has... Well, okay, so let me be a little bit more detailed here. If we say no language has X, like I did with some of the phonological stuff I was talking about, I said, really no language has... or lacks sonorants, right? I stated that as an absolute universal, that no language lacked sonorants. And as such, I'm saying that it is exceptionless, right? There is literally no language that lacks sonorants. Then there's no problem. We can talk all day about, why is that it lacks sonorants? We say it's for an issue of communication. You wouldn't be able to communicate effectively without having a sonorant element to, bump up the noise, if you will, to make the thing louder, the thing that you're trying to say, to make it louder so that you can be heard. That's one thing. That's an absolute universal. But if I say, most languages tend to follow the patterns dictated by branching direction theory. So most languages tend to have postpositions if they are verb final. Well, you can start to explain that in terms of processing efficiency. And that's where you get yourself into a corner. Because then you're saying, well, this language that has prepositions and verb final VPs is less efficient than another language. So now you've got to explain something else. You've given an explanation for why most languages pattern the way they do, and certainly it's a plausible explanation. I'm not saying it's a wrong explanation, but you do force yourself into this corner. Then is a language that doesn't abide by those tendencies less efficient or more complex or X or Y or Z? You force yourself into a comparison that you really don't want to force yourself into. So hopefully this has been somewhat illustrative. There's a lot more that I could have gone over on this episode. It's a huge question. I'll probably even do another episode on it a little bit further down the road once I tackle some of the other topics. But this has been a topic that's been on my suggestion list for a while, so I did want to do at least one episode for it. Most of the stuff I mentioned, of course, was phonological, but I threw in some syntactic tendencies in there to try and round it out a little bit. What's the take-home message that I wanted to give with this? You could theoretically come up with a constructed language that had any kind of features you wanted. So I mentioned Mark Okrand and Klingon, right? He made a language that had, V's and no F's. You can do that in a conlang. You can do whatever you want. You can make a conlang that has, no sonorants, that has extremely complicated consonant clusters. You could make a language that was unpronounceable. You could make a language that had syntax that was so convoluted that it would, it's impossible for you, the creator of the language, to come up with a sentence. You could do that. But the question is not what's a possible language. It's what's a possible human language. And that does fall within some set of boundaries. And the only way we find these boundaries is by looking around, right? We have to use typology. We have to figure out what's attested and what's not. And at a certain level, we have to say, if something is unattested, it's impossible. Now, obviously, that can be troublesome, right? That can be troublesome because there could be a language that finally attests something. Something becomes attested because this language does it. And then we have to update our definition of impossible. That was the point of the paper by Dan Everett, was to say Piraha lacks recursion, therefore not all human languages have recursion. By the way, there's another thing that all human languages are supposed to have, recursive structures. Piraha apparently didn't have them, according to Dan Everett. So therefore we must update our thinking about what it means to be a human language and say that recursion is not a required element. Now, there hasn't been a big move to do that, simply because something as big as recursion, and that is a big issue, it seems a lot more plausible that it really is unattested and there's something wrong with the Piraha data in that particular case than to say, no, we can have a human language without recursion. So, I mean, these are very gray issues. All of these issues are very, very gray. But they all come down to the data. It's one of those great areas of linguistics where we can look at the data. We don't have to overly theorize. You can explain the patterns any way you want, but the patterns are always going to be there. And that is what we use to figure out what is a possible human language. Before I close, I'm going to start giving a reading suggestion per episode. Of course, last episode I gave a bunch of books that I thought would be interesting to some of you. But I'm going to give a reading suggestion now in terms of the topic of the episode. So give something that's relative to the topic that I think will be interesting if you want to continue looking at some of these issues. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't re-mention that World's Major Languages book by Bernard Comrie as a great place to look. If you're interested in what makes a possible language, like I said, it comes down to the typology. It comes down to what features you see, and there's no better source for the typology than the World's Major Languages by Bernard Comrie. But that is not my reading suggestion for this week, or this episode. Don't want to stick myself to a week just in case I get off schedule again. This episode's suggestion is a paper, which is actually a chapter, in a book called Language Complexity as an Evolving Variable, edited by Geoffrey Sampson, David Gill, and Peter Treadgill. Studies in the Evolution of Language. And this comes down to that question of once we start looking at possible human languages, we, in some cases, force ourselves into a corner if we try and explain those possible structures with kinds of explanations concerning complexity or efficiency. If we force ourselves into that corner, it gets very muddy and very, very dangerous. And yet it happens all the time because so many of these things, when we're talking about possible human languages, come down to tendencies, right? So a lot of times we do have languages that break the rules, as it were. And certainly we want to give the best description we can of a possible human language, and so we want to include these strong tendencies, and we want to try and explain them away with something. But this is what happens. So this paper is great at looking at this issue. It says, Overall Complexity, A Wild Goose Chase by Guy Deutscher. And it's a really nice, fairly short paper talking about, when you get into this issue and you start looking at complexity of languages, can you have a language be simpler than another language? Can a language be more complex than another one? Is any more efficient than another? So on and so forth. So again, that is in Language Complexity as an Evolving Variable. It's chapter 17, and I'd highly recommend you give it a read if you're interested in anything I've talked about today, because that's sort of the apex of where the conversation ends up. I guarantee it. Anytime you start talking about this stuff, you will end up with this thought in your mind of, well, if you're saying that, postpositions and verb final is the way to do it for processing reasons, what about language X that has prepositions and verb finality? And that's kind of a bad example because there's a lot of languages that have prepositions and verb finality. But some of these tendencies are so strong, right? I mean, look at the OVS sample. 4 languages worldwide in the sample. Are those 4 less efficient? We want to say yes because we want to explain the tendency. We'd love to say that that's an impossible order for a human language. And yet, there's those 4 languages. So, very interesting topic this episode. I hope you found it interesting as well. And I thank you as always for listening. Comments are always welcome at linguistchris@gmail.com or on Twitter @linguistchris. Thanks again.